Her garage was blocked by sandbags, cutting off access to her home. But when she confronted the HOA, the city showed up with bulldozers and fines. Now, this ordinary woman is about to go to war with the powerful forces that think they can control her life. Sandra stared in disbelief at the sandbags barricading the entrance to her garage. This was her property, her home. How dare the HOA do this without warning? Her heart raced with a mix of confusion and outrage as she stormed out the front door. Across the street, the HOA president, Margaret, stood with a smug expression, arms folded. "Good morning, Sandra. I see you've noticed our little project." "Project?" Sandra spat. "You've blocked me from getting into my own garage." Margaret clicked her tongue. Now, let's not overreact. This is for the good of the community. We've been having some issues with flooding, you see, and these sandbags are a necessary precaution." Sandra's jaw dropped. "Flooding? It hasn't rained in weeks." The older woman's eyes narrowed. "Well, better safe than sorry. I'm sure you understand." "I most certainly do not understand." Sandra's voice rose in pitch. "This is my property, and you have no right to." "Actually, we do." Margaret cut her off, a satisfied smile spreading across her face. "As per the HOA bylaws, we have the authority to take reasonable measures to protect the neighborhood, and we've deemed these sandbags necessary." Sandra felt her blood boiling. "This is unacceptable. I'm calling the city. They'll have to remove these immediately." Margaret's smile widened. "Oh, I'm sure they will. But I wonder how they'll feel about the fines you'll be facing for non-compliance." With that, she turned and sauntered back towards her own pristine home, leaving Sandra, stunned and seething, staring at the barrier blocking her access. Sandra stood in her driveway, hands shaking with rage. The nerve of that woman and the HOA, just barging in and blocking her garage like that. This was her home, her property. How dare they think they could just waltz in and do whatever they pleased? Gritting her teeth, she marched back inside and grabbed her phone, quickly dialing the city's non-emergency number. After explaining the situation to the operator, she was told that someone would be dispatched to investigate immediately. Pacing back and forth, Sandra waited anxiously for the city's response. When she finally heard the unmistakable sound of a large vehicle approaching, she hurried outside, relief washing over her. However, that relief quickly turned to dismay as she watched not a tow truck or municipal workers, but a fleet of bulldozers and construction equipment rumble down the street. The vehicles pulled up alongside the sandbags, and within moments, the barrier was swept aside, the sandbags unceremoniously dumped to the side. A municipal worker approached Sandra, clipboard in hand. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to issue you a citation for non-compliance with the HOA's directives. That'll be a $500 fine." "What?" Sandra sputtered, her mind reeling. "But the HOA put those there without my permission." "How can you fine me?" The worker shrugged. "HOA bylaws supersede individual property rights in cases like this. You're responsible for ensuring your property is in compliance." He scribbled something on the clipboard and handed her the citation. "You have 2 weeks to pay the fine or face further penalties." Sandra stood there, gaping, as the worker turned and headed back to the construction crew, who were already beginning to pack up their equipment. This couldn't be happening. How could the city side with the HOA against her like this? Overcome with a mix of disbelief and fury, she turned and stormed back inside, slamming the front door behind her. She needed to find a way to fight this. There was no way she was going to let the HOA and the city steamroll her like this. Pacing back and forth in her living room, Sandra's mind raced as she tried to figure out her next move. The gall of the HOA, putting up those sandbags without her consent, and the city having the audacity to fine her for it. It was a complete outrage. She paused, glancing down at the citation in her hand. $500. That was a hefty sum. One that would put a serious dent in her monthly budget, and the threat of further penalties if she didn't pay. This was clearly a calculated move by the HOA to assert their dominance and flex their power. Gritting her teeth, Sandra knew she couldn't back down. This was her home, her property, and she wasn't going to let some power-hungry homeowners association and a complicit city trample all over her rights. Grabbing her laptop, she began furiously researching her options. There had to be a way to fight this, to hold the HOA and the city accountable for their actions. As she scoured through forums and legal resources, an idea began to take shape. Reaching for her phone, she dialed a number she'd been hesitant to call, but now seemed like the only viable option. "Hello, this is Sandra. I need to speak to a lawyer, immediately." The conversation was terse and to the point. Sandra laid out the entire situation, highlighting the HOA's overreach and the city's apparent collusion. The lawyer listened intently, then thoughtfully presented a few potential avenues of recourse. "It sounds like you have a solid case for abuse of power and violation of your property rights," the lawyer concluded. "I'd be happy to take this on, but you should know it may get messy. The HOA and the city aren't going to back down without a fight." Sandra nodded resolutely. "I'm prepared for that. This isn't just about the fine. It's about standing up to their bullying tactics. They can't just do whatever they want without consequence." With that, she booked an appointment, determined to take the fight to the HOA and the city. She wasn't going to let them walk all over her without a fight. The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings, paperwork, and strategy sessions as Sandra worked closely with her lawyer to build her case against the HOA and the city. They pored over local bylaws, HOA regulations, and municipal codes, searching for any loopholes or precedents that could work in her favor. As the deadline for paying the $500 fine loomed, Sandra steeled herself for what she knew would be a drawn-out and contentious battle. But the prospect of rolling over and accepting the HOA's heavy-handed tactics was simply unacceptable to her. Finally, the day of the crucial meeting arrived. Sandra took a deep breath as she and her lawyer entered the municipal building, bracing themselves for the confrontation ahead. Across the table, the HOA president, Margaret, sat with a smug expression, flanked by the city's legal counsel. "So nice of you to join us, Sandra," she purred. "I must say, I'm surprised you've decided to take this matter to court." Sandra felt a surge of anger, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I'm here because your actions were completely unacceptable. You had no right to block my garage without my consent, and the city had no right to fine me for it." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "The HOA bylaws clearly state that we have the authority to take measures to protect the community, and the city was simply enforcing those regulations." "Regulations that you manipulated to suit your own agenda," Sandra shot back. "This was nothing more than an abuse of power, and I won't stand for it." The city's lawyer cleared his throat. "Be that as it may, the fine is still valid, and you're required to pay it within the allotted time frame." Sandra's lawyer leaned forward. "Actually, we've done our research, and there are several precedents that support our position. The HOA's actions were clearly outside the scope of their authority, and the city's enforcement of those actions was unlawful." The tension in the room was palpable as the two sides squared off, each determined to emerge victorious. The meeting dragged on for hours as the lawyers for both sides presented their arguments, each side growing more heated and entrenched in their positions. Sandra watched with a mixture of trepidation and resolve, knowing that the outcome of this confrontation could have serious implications for her. At one point, Margaret slammed her hand on the table, her face flushed with anger. "This is outrageous. The HOA has always had the authority to take necessary actions to protect the community, and the city has a responsibility to enforce those regulations." Sandra's lawyer remained calm and measured in his response. "That may be true in some cases, but the actions taken here were clearly outside the bounds of reasonable measures. Blocking a homeowner's access to their own property is a clear violation of their rights." The city's lawyer interjected, "The homeowner is still responsible for ensuring their property is in compliance with HOA directives, regardless of whether they agree with them or not. That's where you're wrong, Sandra's lawyer countered. The HOA cannot simply impose arbitrary rules and expect the homeowner to blindly comply, especially when those rules infringe on their basic property rights. The back and forth continued, with each side growing more frustrated and entrenched in their positions. Sandra could feel the tension building, the air thick with a sense of impending confrontation. Finally, the judge presiding over the meeting raised a hand, silencing the room. I believe I've heard enough to make a preliminary ruling. All eyes turned to him as he addressed the parties. The HOA's actions in blocking the homeowner's garage access were indeed outside the scope of their authority, and the city's subsequent enforcement of that action was unlawful. The fine is hereby rescinded, and the HOA is ordered to remove any remaining barriers from the homeowner's property immediately. A stunned silence fell over the room, broken only by the sound of Margaret's sharp intake of breath. Sandra felt a surge of relief and vindication, but she knew this was only the beginning of the battle. As the meeting adjourned, Sandra could feel the palpable tension in the room. Margaret and the city's representatives were clearly fuming, their expressions a mix of barely contained outrage and disbelief. Sandra's lawyer placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. This is a good start, but I have a feeling they're not going to back down without a fight. She nodded, bracing herself for the inevitable fallout. I'm ready for whatever they throw at me. I'm not going to let them bully me into submission. True to her words, the aftermath of the meeting proved to be a relentless onslaught of legal maneuvers and neighborhood drama. Margaret and the HOA wasted no time in filing an appeal, determined to overturn the judge's ruling. Meanwhile, the animosity from the HOA spilled over into the community. Neighbors who had once been friendly with Sandra now eyed her with suspicion, whispering behind her back or outright confronting her on the street. How dare you challenge the HOA? One of her neighbors, a retiree named Mrs. Wilkins, scolded her. They're only trying to protect our property values. You're causing nothing but trouble. Sandra stood her ground, refusing to be cowed by the neighborhood's hostility. I'm not the one causing trouble here. The HOA overstepped their bounds, and I'm not going to just roll over and accept it. Her defiant stance only seemed to inflame the situation further as the HOA ramped up their efforts to discredit her. Flyers appeared in mailboxes, painting her as a selfish troublemaker who was putting the entire community at risk. Undeterred, Sandra continued to fight, working closely with her lawyer to build an even stronger case. They dug deeper into the HOA's history, uncovering a pattern of abusive behavior and disregard for residents' rights. As the battle raged on, both sides became increasingly entrenched, the stakes rising with every passing day. Sandra knew that the outcome of this fight would have far-reaching consequences, not just for her, but for the entire community. The legal battle between Sandra and the HOA raged on for weeks, with both sides stubbornly refusing to back down. The tension in the neighborhood reached a fever pitch as the dispute spilled out into the open, with neighbors taking sides and engaging in heated arguments. Sandra found herself the target of constant harassment, from angry glares and whispered insults to more overt acts of vandalism. Someone had slashed the tires on her car, and she discovered that someone had rummaged through her garbage, scattering the contents across her front yard. Despite the mounting pressure, Sandra refused to be cowed. She remained steadfast in her determination to hold the HOA accountable, even as her own resources began to dwindle. The legal fees were draining her savings, and the emotional toll was taking a heavy burden. But just when it seemed like the fight was about to slip through her fingers, a breakthrough came in the form of a surprise witness, a former HOA board member who had grown disillusioned with the organization's heavy-handed tactics. The ex-board member, a soft-spoken retiree named Mrs. Wilkins, provided detailed testimony about the HOA's history of abusing its power and disregarding the rights of homeowners. She described instances of the HOA intimidating residents, imposing unreasonable fines, and even threatening legal action against those who dared to challenge their authority. Sandra's lawyer pounced on this new evidence, using it to bolster their case and paint a damning picture of the HOA's misdeeds. The judge presiding over the case listened intently, his brow furrowed with a growing sense of concern. As the final arguments were presented, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Sandra sat on the edge of her seat, her heart racing with a mixture of hope and trepidation. This was it, the moment that would determine the fate of her hard-fought battle against the HOA. The judge's gavel came down with a resounding thud, silencing the courtroom. All eyes were fixed on the venerable figure as he stood and delivered his final ruling. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, this court finds that the Homeowners Association has repeatedly abused its power and violated the rights of the homeowners it is meant to serve. He turned his stern gaze toward the stunned HOA representatives. The HOA's actions in this case, including the unlawful blocking of the homeowner's garage access and the imposition of fines, were a clear overreach of their authority. Sandra felt a surge of relief wash over her, a weight lifted from her shoulders. Finally, justice was being served. The judge continued, "Furthermore, the city's complicity in enforcing the HOA's unlawful directives is a betrayal of the public trust. Both the HOA and the city are hereby ordered to cease all harassment and retaliation against the homeowner, and to pay restitution for any damages incurred." Margaret, the HOA president, rose to her feet, her face flushed with rage. "This is an outrage. You can't just." "I can, and I have." The judge cut her off sternly. "This ruling is final, and any further attempts to defy it will be met with severe consequences." As the courtroom erupted in murmurs and hushed conversations, Sandra felt a sense of vindication wash over her. She had stood up to the powerful forces that had tried to control her life, and she had emerged victorious. Walking out of the courthouse, her head held high, Sandra knew that this was just the beginning. The battle against the HOA's abuse of power had only just begun, and she was more determined than ever to fight for the rights of her community. With a newfound resolve, she headed home, ready to take on the next challenge and continue her quest for justice.